Hey, welcome everyone. I'm Ted Erhart. I have some news for you today. This is hot off the press. It's July 28th. You'll probably see this next week from me, but nonetheless, the news is the U.S. economy contracted in the second quarter. And this is getting a lot of press today in financial media because a recession is generally defined as 2 consecutive quarters of negative GDP growth. And that appears to be what we have. But what I want to focus on today is this seems very contradictory when you look at just what's going on more generally. So for instance, the unemployment rate in the United States, way out here on the right-hand side, is still hovering basically on par with 50-year lows. You know, there's literally more job openings than there are people looking for work. And likewise, despite the fact that we have seen some indications of slowing in areas such as housing, and Walmart, even within the last week, said they're seeing signs that the consumers are pulling back a bit. Generally speaking, nonetheless, business conditions are still quite good. So what explains this contradiction? Well, that's what I want to talk about today, specifically the fact that GDP is adjusted for inflation. And that fact can give you some of these weird, kind of contradictory type signals. So that's what we're talking about. Let's get into it. So let's talk about GDP real briefly. First, gross domestic product is the measure of the value of all goods and services produced inside of a country's borders. Now, this is a really kind of complicated and wonky topic. So I, again, just want to focus on one very narrow aspect, the fact that GDP is adjusted for inflation. So let me show you what I'm talking about here. So here's the actual report where places like the Wall Street Journal are getting their data from. GDP is going to be calculated by the Bureau of Economic Analysis, which is part of the U.S. Department of Commerce. And you can see in the first sentence of the first paragraph, real gross domestic product decreased at an annual rate of 0.9%. And the key thing I want to point out is this word real. That means adjusted for inflation. Now, what we can do to contrast this is look at the non-adjusted number, which is on the second page. If we go down here to current dollar GDP, this is also known as nominal GDP, which in that case, the number actually increased by 7.8%. So what's the difference? How should people interpret this? Well, it's very simple. If you, for example, got a raise within the last year of 5%, but inflation was running at 7%. The question is, did you really get a raise? Well, obviously, in nominal terms, yes, your wages went up by 5%, but in real purchasing power, no, you actually fell behind by 2%. And GDP is calculated in this same fashion. So despite the fact that on an annualized basis, as we talked about, GDP grew by 7.8% when we adjust for inflation, which of course is running at those 40-year highs. That's how we end up with this negative number. And I think that's what also helps to explain the fact that, business conditions by many measures actually continue to look quite good despite the fact that we're getting these nasty headline numbers. So if you've been looking at these figures and kind of scratching your head thinking, geez, business conditions in my community seem quite strong, I think the fact that GDP is adjusted for inflation goes a long way in explaining that contradiction. It's one of the only numbers that is adjusted for inflation. I mean, when corporations report quarterly earnings, they're not saying, well, these are earnings. Our earnings grew 10% adjusted for inflation. No one ever says that. So when you get into the weeds of these statistics, it really can kind of create a murky and confusing picture. But look, my whole purpose of creating this was to kind of help clear up that murky picture. So if it was helpful, do me a favor, hit the thumbs up button. I really appreciate it. And I hope we'll see you in the next one.